years ago, I started volunteering with a local tutoring organization in San Diego. Once a week on Tuesdays after work, I tutor children whose families have been displaced from their homes. Some have been in the country for as little as a month, some up to 4 years. I'd work through multiplication tables with boys from Somalia, or teach new vocabulary words to a little girl from Syria. I'd play games and pass out snacks to kids from Iraq, Burma, the Congo, countries whose names are now synonymous with war, violence, and death. I see much of myself in these children. These children are refugees, and a couple of decades ago, so was I. Nobel Prize-winning neurobiologist Eric Kandel said it's likely that humans can't retain memory until key parts of our brains have reached maturity, which happens at about age 5 or 6. I was 6 when the shooting started. But that's not all I remember when I think back on those days. First, I remember the joy I felt because I got to spend days on end playing with my Barbie dolls. I had 11 of them, acquired over the years as presents from my dad when he'd come home from work trips in Germany. One of the Barbies had a mullet, thanks to my cool older cousin who thought it'd be fun to give this classic Barbie a more punk rock look. It was the early 90s. She was definitely my favorite. Senka, pakuj ruksak. Senka, pack your backpack. My mom said in a panicked tone that I would come to know well over the next few years. But in the moment, it was new. We were rushing, and I had one important task: pack my little red backpack with as many of my toys as I could. Naturally, I chose my Barbies, all 11 of them. It was April 1992, and my city was about to be under siege. I was born in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina, 2 years after the city hosted the 1984 Winter Olympics. Sarajevo lies in a valley surrounded by 4 majestic mountains. It was a popular winter sports destination for tourists from all over the world. And for my family, it was home. From October through March, we'd spent every weekend on the slopes of one of these mountains. I learned to ski the same year I learned to walk. On warmer Sarajevo days, we'd walk the streets of Old Town, Bashčašća, full of cafes and shops of tourists and locals alike. Holding my grandma's hand as we traversed the cobblestone streets, she'd buy me anything I ever asked for, in true Nana fashion: clothes, toys, books, candy, you name it. The only time she couldn't fulfill my request was when I asked her to buy me a pair of boobies. My family still won't let me live that one down. My parents were professors. My brother, who's 3 years older than me, was my idol. We lived in the more industrial part of the city, close to the airport, which was convenient for my dad's work travel, and more work travel meant more Barbies. In 1992, that neighborhood became convenient to someone else. The Bosnian Serb army, which had begun to wreak havoc on my city. Serb snipers strategically positioned themselves on top of the high-rise buildings of my streets, an area which would later become known as Sniper Alley. And those same Olympic mountains where I had skied every weekend, they became perfect posts for the snipers to shoot down at men, women, and children in the city. The particular horror of the war in Bosnia is that it started with neighbors turning on neighbors. Serbs who'd lived side by side with my Bosnian Muslim family became enemies, seemingly overnight. And we were on the wrong side. My cousin was 11, my brother was 9, I was 6, and none of us could tell who the attackers were. Serbs, Croats, Bosnians, Muslims, Christians. These are just things that didn't come up in life until they were all that mattered. A child doesn't know what genocide is, what ethnic cleansing means. A child doesn't know what the deliberate mass killing of a targeted group of people is. A child doesn't understand the labels in the first place, let alone that your own label meant someone's trying to kill you. It was just a few months ago that I learned about the day that led to my mom telling me to pack my little red backpack. My dad had stood on our balcony and watched as a woman was crossing the street. She all of a sudden spun around in slow motion and fell to the ground. As a pool of blood gathered around her, she didn't get back up. He looked up and he saw that the shot had come from a sniper perched in a construction crane in the distance. That same day, a neighbor tipped him off that grenades would be next. It was time to leave our neighborhood. After spending the night in our building's basement, the next day, amid cars on fire and shots that sounded no different than fireworks, we drove to my grandma's apartment in another part of town for temporary refuge. There, I got to play with my Barbies in a little corner of my grandmother's bathroom. My grandmother's bathroom was the only room in her apartment without any windows, so it was the only room deemed safe from more sniper fire. I later learned that 3 days after we left our own apartment, a grenade had shattered through my bedroom window. That was also the moment that my parents realized that our time away from home wouldn't be so temporary, and that staying at grandma's may not be enough. So we headed to the nearest train station. We abandoned our car in the station's parking lot. My mom frantically ran around the station trying to find snacks for me and my brother. I'm 2 years shy of the age she was back then. Just a mom trying to feed her babies. I had no clue at the time, of course, that ATMs had stopped working and that we left with $200 to our name. I didn't know that the destination was irrelevant and that the only goal was to get out of the city as quickly as possible. My dad had simply bought 4 tickets for the next available train that was set to leave Sarajevo. And all I knew was what was right in front of me. My mom was bawling her eyes out. And naively, I thought she was upset because she couldn't find snacks for me and my brother. On April 14th, 1992, I got on a train without knowing the destination. I'd never been on a train before. The frequent stops confused me. So did the bearded, angry, yelling men in uniforms. Why were they pointing at male passengers, seemingly at random? And why were they maniacally shouting at them to get off the train? What happened to those passengers? It would be years before I learned what had happened on that train ride. Serb soldiers were stopping the train at random and taking young Muslim men off the train. Men who they feared might take up arms against them. They took those men off the train and they shot them. And I thank my lucky stars that my dad was already in his 40s, that maybe he looked less threatening than the guys in their 20s and 30s. But I'm acutely aware that that same day there were other kids on that train, and they weren't so lucky. That same day, my family of 4 remained a unit, and theirs didn't. I didn't know this then because my parents were so intent on shielding me from everything bad that was happening around us. And perhaps that's part of what made the next few years a little less traumatic than they could have been. Because that was the day I became a refugee. There were many more such trains and buses and random encounters on our journey. It was in my sleep that I first began to process the seriousness of what was happening. I'd spend nights on end sitting up in my sleep, drenched in sweat, screaming at the top of my lungs, "Putsa, putsa, putsa, putsa!" Putsa meant shooting. And I would scream it at the top of my lungs until my mom would grab hold of me and jolt me awake, and I'd just find her crying without really understanding why. We spent 5 years in Germany on a string of temporary 3-month visas. My parents worked odd jobs. My brother became the family translator, leading the conversation at every visa extension appointment with local authorities. Have you ever tried to negotiate a government bureaucracy? Now imagine trying to do it when you're 9 years old. in your second language that you just learned. For the first few months, we lived in barracks on a construction site in Eastern Germany, in former East Germany, where my dad had found some construction work. The barracks housed guest workers from various countries and my little family. I shared a tiny little room with my parents and brother, and the rest of the occupants of the barracks were big, burly men from Eastern Europe, mostly with families back home. We could hardly understand each other, but it didn't take much for me to love them, especially Tomo, the giant man with a giant heart. He always gave me candy, and he always had a smile on his face. It was the first time I would witness kindness of an adult in a strange land. Kindness that would take on many forms over the next few years. Tomo, the guest worker who gave me candy. Frau Lübke, the lady whose house my mom was cleaning, who would let me play with her bunnies and give me piano lessons for free. Muyo, the guy who built a room in his house for my family to live in for a year. Herr Rubisch, the landlord who let us live in his little cabin that he had built for his mother after she'd passed. I witnessed their kindness, big and small. And it all started with their smiles. And it's this kindness that helps me look back on those days of my childhood and remember more joy than pain, even when there was still pain. Like when my school organized a toy drive for those poor little dying kids in Bosnia, and I learned at a very young age what survivor's guilt felt like. Like when, even though I didn't have the permission, I'd catch a glimpse of the evening news on TV and see dead bodies on the streets of the city that I'd escaped. Like when 4 years after living in the same German town, a group of 4 boys on bikes, teenage boys, ran me over on the bike path on my way home from school. As I fell to the ground and felt the stinging sensation of my knee as it scraped the concrete, the boys yelled, "Ausländer raus! Ausländer raus!" Foreigners, get out! A year later, my family would do just that. My parents had begun to seek asylum in other countries in hopes of a better life for me and my brother, in hopes of some more stability and permanence that three-month visas just didn't allow for. Canada said no. Australia said no. New Zealand said no. And the US said yes. So on May 27th, 1997, my family, the foreigners, got out. And we started over for a second time. I was 11 now and still had the same nightmares. It would be 6 years before I'd leave the refugee status behind. Once again, my brother took on responsibilities way beyond the scope of a kid, this time in a third language. My parents worked at the local chocolate factory 7 days a week. My dad took a second job delivering pizzas, a far cry from his days as a professor. And I mostly got to be a kid. I was in school plays, I danced in recitals, I played the piano, and I still had a place to sleep. And you know what helped? More kindness. Kindness from adults in yet another strange land. I was in school plays because Miss Diane taught my family English. I danced in recitals because members of the local church chipped in for my summer program. And when I was sad that I couldn't play the piano at home, Miss Marge arranged for an anonymous donor to donate a piano to me so that I could. And the local moving company even brought it to our house for free because we couldn't afford the transportation costs. And speaking of house, we had one, because of the kind Mr. Ted, who told us about an organization called Habitat for Humanity. And it's this kindness, and with the help of the supportive community, that this refugee kid from Bosnia could feel more than safe. I could feel at home. And I could feel joy. And I don't know where I'd be today without that community and without that type of support. I don't know what I would be contributing to the world if it hadn't been for the dozens, hundreds, thousands of strangers chipping in to make sure that I don't bear the burden of feeling like a refugee every single day of my life. And my one story barely scratches the surface of the millions of stories being created every day due to senseless violence. At this very moment, there are 28 million refugee children in the world. Children who've witnessed unimaginable atrocities. Kids who've gotten on trains or planes or buses or boats without knowing the destination. Kids who have no idea who the attackers are and why someone's trying to kill them. And some are traveling alone. In fact, in the first half of 2016, 28,000 children arrived at the US border alone. In City Heights, the neighborhood in which I tutored, kids come from all over. Many of them have missed out on basic childhood experiences and years of formal schooling due to war. I feel fortunate to be an advocate for this community, to give them hope and to show them some of the kindness that I witnessed as a child in a foreign land. One of the kids, Maria from Syria, she stole my heart. She reminds me so much of me when I was her age. She wants to learn, she wants to play, she loves to dance, and she loves to talk. But she's lacking the words in the language in which she's now supposed to express herself perfectly. And her smile, it lights up a room. And I've witnessed kindness from these children in return. I've seen it. One evening, when I was trying to get two rambunctious young boys to do their math homework and they were dawdling, I decided to turn it into a little game. Whoever would finish their homework first would receive a bag of Skittles. Of course, they didn't know I had a second bag waiting for the boy who'd finished second. So they raced to the finish. And as promised, I awarded the bag of Skittles to the boy who finished first. But he didn't open it right away. He waited for the other boy to finish his homework. And when he did, he opened his bag of Skittles, he split the contents in half, and shared it with his friend. These are remarkable children. And they just want to be kids. They want to play with Barbies. They want to read books. They want candy. And yeah, some of them will have to help their parents translate difficult, complex government documents when they're 9 years old. Some will see the rubble on TV and recognize that that was once their home. Some will be told to get out because they're foreign. And many will have lots of trauma to process well into adulthood. And that already sucks. But that shouldn't be all they have. These children, like all children, they deserve our kindness. They deserve their Barbies, the books, the piano lessons, the love. At the very least, they deserve our smiles. Because when they look back on their childhoods, they deserve to feel happiness, just like I did. They deserve to feel joy. Thank you.